So hi everybody again. This is AJ Ehrenstein here for day 2 of Social Sciences Graduate School Week. Thanks for joining as the rain starts to come down here in Brooklyn. We are a relatively small group today, so I hope that if you have questions, you won't be shy to shout them out via the chat. And our topic for this afternoon is the application process for graduate programs in the social sciences. There are a couple of quirks to applying to master's and PhD programs in social sciences disciplines that I kind of want to call out. I also kind of want to take a lot of questions that you might have about how to navigate the process. We'll talk a little bit about how to ask for letters of recommendation for faculty. By the way, this afternoon's presentation is brought to you by Lime LaCroix, perfect for 98-degree days here in New York City. And we'll end off, as usual, with some concrete steps, regardless of whether you are planning to apply this fall, whether you're thinking about applying a year from now, or whether you're just kind of thinking in general about whether graduate school will be a good fit for you and your discipline within the foreseeable future. So one more time before we get going, if you haven't yet, I'm going to send the link to the sign-in sheet one more time. Super helpful if you can just fill that out, name and uni, and we'll get you down for having been here this afternoon. And last time I'll say it, any questions throughout, feel free to give a shout in the chat. So as you know, it's part of Beyond Barnard's summer colloquium, which continues right up to the start of the academic semester, just about. We'll take a few weeks off after August 20th with programs, and then we will be off to the races with the 2020-2021 academic year. It feels like the future, y'all. We talked about this a little yesterday, so I'm not going to repeat too much of what we're doing this week, but here's the layout for graduate school in the social sciences week. Yesterday, we talked a little bit about introductions to programs, the master's and PhD level primarily. Today, we're talking about the application process. Tomorrow, we'll dig specifically into best practices for writing personal statements in these disciplines. Thursday, we have a fantastic alumni panel, and Friday, we'll round it out with some comments from faculty at Barnard. I'll keep sharing the learning objectives every day, just so you can kind of keep track of the things that you're learning throughout. And then obviously this is always shared. Presentations are always shared on the evening after each talk. What to expect today? Well, like I said, we're gonna try to outline a plan to apply to graduate programs in the short term and the longer term. So I've basically outlined it at 2 levels. If you are applying between now and December, just theoretically, and if you're applying over the course of a full academic year into the following fall. Happy to answer questions about when it's appropriate timeline-wise to go to graduate school. We talked a little bit about that yesterday, but in the Q&A today, and I'm leaving more time since we kind of ran short on the clock yesterday, definitely save time for questions that you might have about your own personal timing or just timing that you've talked about with your friends. We'll describe some differences in the elements of a graduate application, especially versus the undergraduate application. And I want to help you sketch out a plan based on your specific interests and directions. What else can you expect today? We're sticking with dogs again. This is Murphy the golden doodle. He is my wife's mom's baby, basically. Since we don't visit too often in Chicago these days, Murphy essentially is the official new son in the family. So what else to expect today is lots of pics of Murphy looking always a little sad. I don't know, does anybody have designer dogs like this? And he is a genetically engineered dog for like perfect, cute, sad eyes and basically running around this tiny apartment that my wife's mother owns. So the rest of today's agenda, aside from pictures of Murphy that I put into this presentation, mostly to entertain myself, but also hopefully you, is we'll go through a full overview of the process first, kind of give you the broad view, and then I want to drill down into some of the most common questions that I hear in advising when it comes to letters of recommendation, the written materials that you're expected to produce for these applications, building a community of support and what that means, thinking about multiple stakeholders that can be helpful as you apply, talking a little bit about campus visits and interviews, which in my experience so far still are happening. Campuses still are holding virtual visits. They still are, in some cases, holding interviews. I've actually seen a big uptick in the number of interviews that are required for applicants, especially to doctoral programs in the social sciences in the past few years, and I anticipate that will continue, that trend will continue. And then I'm just gonna say 5 words about standardized tests. Kind of just kidding, it's like 5 first words, and then I have a few other things to add to my perspective about graduate school, specifically in these fields, not for things like law and medical school. I'm going to focus on my perspective on PhD and master's programs in these disciplines. So here we go. We'll start with the full overview of the process. And here's Murphy in one of his many, many handkerchiefs. Broken this down, like I said, if you have 5 or 6 months, and if you have a year and a half. So let's say you are really scrambling right now. You're in your office, your den, your bedroom, your dining room, wherever you are holing up during this virtual period, and you're thinking, oh my God, I really want to go to graduate school. By December, I want to have my applications in. By January, I want to have my applications in. How can I possibly get this done? Well, here's how I'd lay it out. We'll be in August in just 3 more days by my clock. And I think August is when you should really start getting going. Obviously, that's another way of saying you should get going right away. I don't think you're behind. I don't think you need to panic. I don't think you're in any way out of the ballpark of getting things going, but you have to move, starting with some intention this coming month. The very first thing to do is reflect on your goals and try to understand what you're hoping to get out of graduate school. We talked a little bit about that yesterday. I think in terms of tactical practices, you need to immediately ask for letters of recommendation from your faculty. And again, we'll talk a little bit about the strategies for going through the process of asking for letters. I think another good thing to do at this point is to start reaching out to alumni who are in the graduate programs where you want to attend graduate school, or who are potentially even faculty at the programs where you might want to attend graduate school. If we have time today, I'm going to go through a couple of quick ways that you can actually explore alumni who are in graduate programs or who've completed graduate programs and actually used the strategies that I would model to find all of the speakers for this week's alumni panel, just using LinkedIn. I think by the end of August, it would be good to finish a first draft of a personal statement. So that means potentially attending tomorrow's session and getting some pointers on how to outline your personal statement, and basically arriving to campus in person or virtually, ready to submit a first draft of your personal statement to people who can provide editorial feedback on it. I like to say that you should be understanding deadlines. You should be doing some of the nitty-gritty stuff of understanding when specific programs are going to require you to be submitting applications. And I think you should probably try to review your statement in progress at Beyond Barnard with me, with Lindsay Granger-Weaver, with Christine Valenza-Shin, with Brianna Roman, with Alexa Hamill, with Nikki Youngblood-Giles, with any of the advisors who are qualified to take a look at your statement. So in September, if you're going to be applying, let's say you are a senior, a rising senior, you don't have a thesis done yet. So what you want to do is choose and edit a writing sample based on a previous seminar paper that you've written for one of your classes. Typically in these disciplines, a writing sample is going to be about 20 to 22, 25 pages and probably no longer. You really need to pay attention to the page limits, the word counts that are in these applications, because faculty just won't read beyond the maximum amount allotted. And in some cases, they won't make it that far. So it's important to have polished paper. In some cases, applications will ask you to submit a graded paper with comments on it. In most cases, they will only ask you to submit a writing sample that is representative of your work. That work should align with something that you are interested in studying in the program. Your statement and writing sample in September should then both go to faculty members to make sure that they have adequate time to try to get a letter together as quickly as possible. So it's important to send a packet of information to faculty about your academic experience. We'll talk a little bit more about that when I say a few words about letter request, the etiquette around requesting letters of recommendation. I'm a big fan of Interfolio. If you've heard of Interfolio, give me a thumbs up right now. And if it's unanimous, I won't say anything more. But I see only one popping up so far, so I'm going to say a thing about Interfolio. Interfolio is what's called a dossier service. They will hold on to letters of recommendation for you. Faculty will upload them directly to Interfolio. And then you, without seeing the letters, because you need to waive your right to seeing the letters, keeping them confidential, meaning that faculty will submit letters without you seeing them. Interfolio will then send the letters on your behalf. You will check boxes off that specify which institutions you want to send letters to, and it will just take care of all of that for you. It's a huge time saver. It's about $50. It is an expense. No expense around applying to graduate school is a small expense. It all adds up, but it is worth it in terms of the amount of time that you will save. I can say more about that in Q&A for sure if you have questions. I have Spreadsheet-orama here because I think you should really create a Google Sheet, not a Microsoft Excel document that you could lose in a power failure or crash. Create a Google Sheet, one row for each institution that you're thinking about applying to, and use that one spreadsheet to track what materials are required, what deadlines are, and how far along you are at applying to those institutions, to each institution. I think it's also savvy, particularly at the doctoral level at this point, to reach out to program faculty, to reach out to faculty who could be potential advisors to you at the institutions where you're thinking about applying. Some students place a great deal of emphasis on one or two particular faculty members who are part of a big department, let's say at Cornell, and they'll get into the program only to find out that the two faculty members that they are interested in working with are going to be retiring and won't take any more advisees. So at this point in the cycle, it's appropriate to reach out to faculty at institutions where you're interested in studying, not to say, hey, are you retiring? Hey, are you thinking about leaving your institution? But instead saying, hey, I'm a big fan of your research. I read this journal article on X. I'd love to talk about your work, and I'm thinking about applying to the program next fall. You want to initiate conversations with faculty whose research interests seem like they might align with yours, with the intention of trying to suss out whether they are able to take on advisees in that first conversation with them. By October, you should have drafted your CV. We can talk about that at Beyond Barnard. There are draft CVs available on our website. You can also definitely do individual advising about translating your one-page resume into more of an academic CV that's appropriate for application to these programs. You might want to start on additional essays that are required by the programs. So diversity statements are increasingly required by programs. Diversity statements will traditionally ask something like, what will your perspectives add to this community? Or how do you intend to make a contribution to a diverse and equitable community at this institution? Some essays will ask you about your specific professional experience. We'll ask you to say a few things about your lab experience, if you're in psychology or maybe even other disciplines. There are usually not as many kind of secondary, ancillary, supplementary essays as there are at the undergraduate level, but they might exist. One essay that I see students taking advantage of a lot at the master's level is that if there's anything you want to tell us about your academic record, please use this space to tell us. This is a great place to talk about a semester where you had to maybe take a leave, a grade that didn't work out the way that you wanted it to work out, or a lot of other issues that might come up throughout a four-year undergraduate process. You might want to finish those essays during October. One thing I definitely wanted to call out is the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship Program, NSF-GRFP. This is something that is open to all social sciences disciplines. You can apply for NSF-GRFP before you even know whether you're in graduate school. And NSF-GRFP provides students with access to, I think it's this year's $34,000 of fellowship funding. This is, again, open to all social sciences disciplines. And you can then take that funding to whatever institution you go to. It's an incredible program. Barnard students in the hard sciences have been especially effective at winning these in the past couple of years. And I think that as we continue to create visibility around the availability of these funds for social sciences students, it will become something that you all pursue successfully more and more often. Just a note, because I know we have some alumni on the call too, this is also open to alumni. You can apply to NSF-GRFP as an applicant to graduate school and not know what institution you're going to yet. You can also apply once you're in a program. I should mention this is for doctoral programs. You can apply once you're in a doctoral program at an institution as well. In November, you want to finalize most of your documents. Make sure that faculty understand deadlines. Checking in politely with faculty to remind them, to give them a little nudge on deadlines can be good practices. By November, you should be done with standardized tests, hopefully. You want to finalize the mechanical elements of your application. And by that, I mean, you want to check off all of the nitty-gritty boxes, sending transcripts, making sure that any additional documentation is sent to the institutions, because December, you really want to be ready to submit. There are some programs who, whose deadlines are in January 1st, January 15th, but I think that you should try to be ready to apply in all cases by December in case you need to make any last minute adjustments. Every year, the deadline for the California system sneaks up on people. It's usually around December 15th and people don't notice. So have everything ready by December 1. You never know what's going to happen. It's going to make your submission process more complicated. I'm going to lay out the same thing, but at 17 months. So essentially, if you're thinking about applying by next fall, if you have a year to consider, if you're an underclass student at this point, if you're an alumna and you're thinking about this for the longer term, I think that this is a luxurious amount of time to think about applying to graduate school. I think it's an amount of time that gives you space to connect more often with faculty at the programs to which you are thinking of applying. I think it's a great time right now or into September, between September and December, to do outreach to both alumni and to the program faculty at the places where you're interested in applying, to talk about your research agenda, to talk about their work, and to just get to know one another a little bit. These kinds of faculty connections can be really important because senior faculty members may be on admissions committees themselves. They also might have the ability to talk to other individuals on the admissions committee and say, hey, I have my eye on Hannah. She's a great student coming out of Barnard right now. And I'd like to make sure that we take an extra close look at her application when it comes in. She's an impressive research record. May through August, I think if you are applying next fall, you might want to pick your courses this year. If you're still at Barnard, pick your courses with the intention of getting to know faculty a little bit better. Pick courses where you intend to go to office hours a little bit more because you have a sense that you want to create a relationship with a faculty member. If you're already an alumna and you're thinking about applying a year from now, in this fall, it's not about classes, but it may be about reaching out to faculty for the first time in a while and saying, hey, remember me? I was in your class in 2000X, and I'm starting to think about graduate school. It'd be great to connect throughout this year. Giving yourself a little bit more time to establish relationships can make it so that the person gets to know you a little bit better over the course of the next year. Again, if you're applying this fall, totally fine, totally doable. If you have more time, these are some of the things that I think you can take advantage of. And again, I'll send these slides this evening so you can review the schedule and ask questions. I see that some questions may have come in. Can you request a letter of recommendation from a professor whose class you haven't taken yet, e.g. from a class that's coming up this semester? I'll get to that. Actually, it's a great question, Allison. I'll talk about that when I talk about letters specifically. So in terms of the rest of the timeline, here's what acceptance season looks like as Murphy wags his tail waiting for a walk. So unlike undergraduate decisions, which typically come out by April, I found that master's and PhD programs in these disciplines typically give their decisions by early to late February. It's essentially an arms race. The sooner that programs can get decisions to candidates, the likelier it is that they think that they'll be able to snag those candidates away from other top programs. So we've actually seen master's decisions for top programs continue to creep backwards into February. In the bad old days, it used to be that PhDs would let folks know, and then once the PhDs knew who they were going to accept, then they would issue decisions to master's programs. Sometimes that's because folks will be accepted to PhD programs and maybe kind of go to a different institution, at which point a master's student, a master's candidate could be slotted into a PhD slot. Sometimes it's because individuals who are declined at the PhD level are automatically considered for entry into admission at the master's level. I know this happens actually at the two last institutions that I worked at. One is, which is an institution dedicated to social sciences, the New School for Social Research, and the previous was the University of Chicago. Applicants to the PhD program are automatically considered for master's programs if those applications are not accepted into PhDs. Like I said, PhD campus interviews are becoming more common in the social science disciplines as what's called holistic review becomes more and more common. It essentially gives candidates the chance to get to know the faculty a little bit better. to get to talk about other elements of their personality, their identity, their background that might help faculty understand how the admission of a candidate to a cohort of PhD students or master's students might contribute to a diverse, equitable, and therefore more robust academic and intellectual environment. I think it's great news that these are becoming more common. Barnard students tend to do very well in interviews too, and we can of course prepare you for interviews. I think they'll take on a different tenor this year. This will be the first year that we are really looking at virtual interviews, but we're certainly capable of training you to be ready for those when they come up through Beyond Barnard. In March, you'll see remaining PhD acceptances kind of flood in, and campus visits will be open to folks as well. So this is a little bit tricky. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit. When you're interviewing on campus or visiting campus to kind of attend classes, you're under evaluation the entire time you're there. And it's important to make sure that the way that you approach pre-formal admission visits or pre-formal admission interviews is careful, professional, and kind of on the lookout for ways in which a selection committee, other students, and other faculty may be evaluating your candidacy, even in moments that are not formal interview settings. So like I said, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. By mid to late March, typically most master's acceptances have been issued. You'll get some news about waiting lists from there. April is when decisions are required by candidates themselves. So sometimes PhD decisions will be a little bit sooner than that because they want to fill out their cohorts and continue to accept other candidates off of waiting lists. But by May, most of the final decisions have been made and folks will come off waiting lists for PhD programs for sure by then. I will say in my experience, in some cases, waiting lists can stay open all summer for some of the larger master's programs in social sciences disciplines, and you may be accepted as close to the start of a program as June or July. So what does it mean to ask for letters of recommendation with some etiquette behind it? So the first is I really typically, and here's Murphy, that was his favorite toy for a little while, that squeaky Nerf ball. It got lost under a couch. We couldn't find it. By the end of the weekend, he just we turned around and it appeared and he had it in his mouth again. He was definitely hiding it from me and Gina. So I suggest not emailing alone. So emailing a professor to ask for a letter of recommendation is not totally out of the realm of things that are acceptable, but I think it's better to first ask for a conversation about your work and suggest in that conversation that you're interested in graduate school. I think that on balance, it's best to pick faculty who already know you and know your work. It's not out of the realm of possibility to ask a faculty member in September, after you have maybe a month of classes under your belt, if they'd be willing to write a letter of recommendation for you. I don't think it's even out of the question, to Alice's point, that you go to office hours at the start of the academic year and say, listen, I'd love to see how things go this semester, and I'm wondering if I perform well in the class, or what are the things that I can do to perform well in the class such that you might be open to writing a letter of recommendation. You need to be ready for the answer to maybe being no. But I think that it's best to approach this conversation from the perspective of, I'd love to talk about your research. I'm really interested in your work. I'm hoping that I can continue to contribute to this class. I wanted to talk about graduate school and to see if you'd be open to writing a strong letter of recommendation. This is what you do in the meeting. Let's assume that you get the meeting with the professor. Starting by talking about graduate school generally and making the ask, would you be able to write a strong letter of recommendation for me for these programs? And again, I think if you're deciding between a kind of really prominent individual to write a letter for you and some who doesn't know you very well and someone who is less prominent but knows your work intimately, I would say almost 10 times out of 10, you should go for that person who knows you best. The best letters are letters from faculty members who have a better relationship with you. Notice I keep saying faculty. And I would say for certainly doctoral programs in the social sciences and for most master's programs as well, you should be concentrating on 3 to 4 letters from faculty at Barnard, Columbia, or other places where you have relationships with faculty from intellectual academic experiences. There are certainly master's programs and some clinical PhD programs that may place a priority on certain kinds of professional references. So I'm thinking about social work programs, I'm thinking about clinical psychology, I'm thinking about places where the degree is oriented a little bit more to a professional outcome. Policy school, law school, these things almost go without saying. If you know a judge from a previous internship that you have, having that judge write a letter for law school can be a big asset. But in the main, for master's and PhD programs in social sciences disciplines, it's best to ask just faculty. I think that you should ask them in the meeting what their preference is for reviewing and reading materials so that you understand when you should be sending your personal statement, when you should be sending your your writing sample to them for review. Some faculty will tell you, send me everything right in September. Some will say very outright, you know what, I'm not going to look at this until after Halloween, so send it in November, and that's when I'll really get to focus. What you want to do is be respectful of their time while realizing that lots and lots of students do ask faculty for, and alumni for that matter, of course, ask faculty for letters of recommendation. It's not something you need to be intimidated by. It's a big part of being a faculty member. It's something that you probably won't even be the first person to ask that day, but it's something you need to be careful about when it comes to just being respectful and clear that you are managing time effectively. So here, for example, I suggest sending fewer emails that are organized in a really methodical way rather than scattershot. So if your personal statement is ready in one day and your writing sample is ready to be edited the following week, I would typically recommend sending everything all at once so that the professor just has to look at one thing and edit things from one place. Does this make sense so far? Are we going too easy? Like, send me comments. I can't, I'm staring into the void, so sometimes it's tough, but thanks for the thumbs ups. If there are other questions, I have to say, just to pause on this for a second, asking faculty for letters of recommendation is one of the areas of most trepidation and anxiety that we hear from students. And I think there's a big mismatch here. It feels like a big ask for students, but in my experience working with faculty, particularly at Barnard, it's really not a burden. Faculty love writing these things. It's a real pleasure when they get to write a letter of recommendation for someone whose partnership and research and in scholarship they've appreciated. And as a liberal arts college faculty member, especially so, I'm thinking particularly about Barnard here, but I do know that Columbia faculty have been very generous with their time as well. It's a totally different proposition. They're extremely excited to be supportive of your academic goals. To that end, I would say always follow through. Thank you notes go a long way. Keeping faculty abreast of decisions. So if you have someone write a letter for you and it works out, great, you should totally send them a thank you. I remember when I got into a creative writing program years ago, I sent my advisor a case of Diet Coke because she loves Diet Coke and she's addicted to it. But express your gratitude in the way that's appropriate to you and to the relationships that you have with your faculty members. Barnard students and alums are famous for just really excellent thank you notes, and they handwritten thank you notes, and they just go so far. It's a nice human touch, and I think it's part of an acknowledgement that, especially if you're going to graduate school and intending on establishing yourself in the discipline, these relationships will be lifelong. And so it's important to let them know. If it didn't work out and you didn't get in, that's also something you should communicate. Let them know. There's nothing to be ashamed of about not getting into a competitive set of programs, especially your first time around the track. Sometimes it does take multiple tries to get into these programs. They're competitive, nothing out of the ordinary, and faculty like to hear, how can we do it differently next time? So definitely follow through. Okay. So in terms of written materials, although a great question from Elizabeth, how would you approach this if a professor has made an open-ended offer to write you a recommendation at a time you didn't need it? This is a great question. This comes up more often than you would think. So two things. One is if you have Interfolio, they can write their letter whenever, upload it to Interfolio, and just forget about it. And you can send it or send it back to them for slight edits after some indeterminate period of time. The dossier service will hold the letter in reserve so that the professor can write it when their mind is fresh and then return to it when you need it. I would also say, like, one of the things I could have mentioned a little bit more clearly here is you can make it easy for the professor by sending notes along with your personal statement and letter. I'm sorry, your personal statement and your writing sample that says, here's what I was hoping you would emphasize in your letter. So I like to use the example of choosing a thesis advisor and someone from seminar, let's say. Your thesis advisor, you may want to have talk about the depth of your argument, the applicability of the stakes of your argument for the field, and the way that you compose yourself in the course of writing a project, planning and executing a project. For a seminar faculty member, you may want to say, okay, Professor X is going to take care of talking about my management of the thesis project. What I'd love for you to talk about is the way that I bring a collaborative approach to seminar conversations. It would be most helpful if you could talk about the way that I participated in class and made the space feel intellectually open. You can help letter writers by telling them what aspects of your experience you'd like them to emphasize in your letters. I love this that questions are coming in today. Thank you. Is it a good idea to ask your advisor, who is also your professor, for a letter? My advisor was my professor for a lab, but the class was cut short due to COVID, canceled classes, canceled assignments. So I think this is going to come up a lot this year. And I think that the basic answer is have a conversation first. So this is why emailing about, would you be open to a conversation about class this semester? I'm thinking about graduate school and I'd love to talk to you about my applications and next steps. I think having a conversation with someone, even in this, dumb venue of the virtual space, is an opportunity to say, listen, I'm frankly not sure, what do you think about writing a letter? Do you feel like you'd be ready to write a strong letter based on our interactions so far? Is there anything that I can do this fall? Produce some research for you, do a literature review. Maybe we can meet weekly or regularly to talk about research that would help you get to know my work a little bit better so that you would be ready to write a strong letter. These are things that you can offer in this particularly weird situation where classes that were cut short and you may have not had the opportunity to get to know faculty in the way that you wanted. So I hope that answered the question there, but we can, of course, return to it too. Okay, in terms of written materials, we'll talk a lot more about the personal statement tomorrow, but I want to just kind of lay out, for those of you who might not be able to join, I wanted to provide some initial framing thoughts, and this will set us up for tomorrow as well. A personal statement, which is often also known as a research statement or a statement of research intent, is not a college essay. It does not begin with, I was hanging from a cliff by my fingernails with sharks swimming below me. And at that moment, I realized I wanted to go to UCLA's PhD program in sociology, right? So you're not looking for a kind of, transformational moment that serves as a hook for why you want to go study, the effects of, the effects of poverty on whether people enjoy candy. I don't know. I'm not a social scientist, and thinking up behavioral economics projects is not my forte. But you essentially want to be saying who you are as a scholar and not just as a person. Okay, this is a tough task. And some schools have gotten really, really restrictive on their word count. So you're going to get this down to 500 to 1,000 words. And you want to essentially, in those 500 to 1,000 words, trace your intellectual and personal development. Or as I like to often say it, you want to trace your personal development through an intellectual lens. So less about, since I was a child, I've enjoyed political science. More about, at Barnard, I pursued my development as a political scientist through a year-long thesis project that examined poverty and race in New York City, a topic that is especially important to me given, X kind of personal story. So notice that the personal becomes kind of the secondary to, here's this intellectual project that I am putting together. Overall, if the personal statement was an essay prompt, it would ask the question of why you are a good fit for graduate school. So the kind of prompt that you might remember from college is this open-ended, who are you and what would you bring to UVA, which is where I went. This is more like are you a good fit for this particular graduate program and the work that we do here? So it's a very different type of question that requires a very different type of answer. It's much more related to your intellectual production than it is to who you are in your soul. The great news is no one will hold you to the project that you propose in your personal statement. When you write a personal statement, you are not saying, this is what I will study in graduate school. What you are saying instead is, this is one thing that I could study in the context of the program at University of Pittsburgh. And you're basically demonstrating that you understand what an intellectual project at the graduate level looks like. In doing so, fit matters. So you need to show not that just Harvard is a world-renowned university and it would be an honor to go there. No, you need to say something specific about the 5 faculty who look especially interesting to work with, or the particular archival holdings that are available in the library, or the proximity to the Kennedy School and the ability to work across disciplines between political science and policy. Speaking specifically about why an institution is a good fit for you is incredibly important in distinguishing yourself from other candidates. When it comes to the writing sample, it's 20 of your best pages, not your most creative, not necessarily your most creative, certainly not your most outlandish or experimental. This is not a place, these applications, at least, we're going to talk about MFAs next week as part of our humanities discussions, but this is not a place for creative writing. It instead demonstrates your understanding of how to structure an academic argument using the rules that are appropriate to the discipline. So this often in the social sciences means a pretty hefty methodology section. It means outlining the particular contribution of the argument, but also the way that you've built that argument based on particular methodological approaches from your field or subfield. You should always revise your writing sample for the purpose of submitting an application. I've seen too many folks just think that the way that a paper is written for a class is the same exact thing that they should submit for the application. And frankly, many, many times a strong round of revisions will drastically improve the quality of your writing sample so that it's appropriate for the application. When you're writing these things, you should absolutely consult with your advisor. This is important not only because they can provide really good line edits, but because often Barnard faculty know the programs that you're applying to, and they will know the very specific ways that small details in your argument will resonate with the faculty in a particular place. Remember that each institution has its own intellectual culture. I do not think that the writing sample is something that needs to be revised, at least in these fields, for every single institution. However, there are small cues that can help faculty understand why your project, I'm just going to use behavioral economics again, I kind of have it's on repeat in my head today, but why your project is really a good fit for a behavioral economics program where the strengths are on the overlaps between psychology and economics, and not so much for a labor economics PhD program, where really the focus is on structures of unions, let's say, or something like that. Right? So catering your sample really specifically to the institution in those ways, that's something your advisor can help you with. We talked about respecting length requirements. I think that probably is obvious to many of you. But I think also you want your sample to be representative of the kind of work that you're talking about in your personal statement. The best MA doctoral packets of application materials, in those packets, the personal statement and the writing sample work in conjunction with one another. You're not talking about being a kind of graduate student that's totally different in your personal statement from the person you are on paper in the writing sample. In the best packets, these things work in tandem with one another. Okay, building a community of support, I think there are some things that are obvious about how I got a fisheye lens. For some reason, my father-in-law bought me a fisheye lens for my iPhone. So this is Murphy through a fisheye lens. You can see it was Christmas and trees in the background. People know that they can connect with Barnard faculty and with Beyond Barnard. I think the part of building a community of support around your graduate school applications that's not always evident to people is surrounding yourself with students and fellow alumni or alumni if you're a current student to help you through the process. I I'm always saying that the most underutilized resource for current Barnard students is other students. And peer editing your papers, peer editing your personal statements throughout this project of applying to graduate school is one of the best things that you can possibly do. But I find that also, as usual, Barnard alumni are exceptionally generous with their time and their perspective. And that includes when it comes to graduate school. So alumni can give you real perspective on what it's like to be a woman in a department. It can give you, in a particular social sciences department, it can give you a perspective on the overall culture in terms of identity and inclusion in a department. It's really important to get real advice about these things before you commit to a program for multiple years. And Barnard alumni will tell you how a program comes together in these areas, but they can also tell you, of course, about the intellectual work, the quality of the advising, individuals that have been particularly important. Sometimes they identify other Barnard individuals for you to work with. They can be exceptionally helpful. And I just wouldn't want anybody to think that networking is something you do if you want a career in like finance and, you know, entertainment, but not in graduate school. And as you get into graduate school and realize that it is a career move itself, you'll realize that it is one of the most, one of the places, one of the industries, one of the fields of life that most values connections with other individuals. Hope that made sense. I think it's also really savvy to connect with the department administrators for the programs that you're applying to. These are the people that pull the process levers. They can be exceptionally influential in master's programs, especially. Sometimes they sit in on the admissions committees and can talk about the questions that students have brought to, the prospective students have brought to their conversations. So typically this is the person who's like answering your emails with questions about deadlines. And sometimes they're the only administrative person in the department. All of the faculty know them. They're a resource. They know who's going to be on leave before anybody else does. So they can be really good resources to get to know. I'm trying to think of other things that I really wanted to call out about this. I think the last thing to really call out is how you can use the faculty who are at the institutions where you want to study. If you have a lot of time and you really know that a faculty member is in the same space that you're interested in now, it can be really beneficial to reach out to a faculty member along the shared lines of research. This is something that STEM folks do really well because at Barnard especially, they're constantly conducting research in labs at Mount Sinai or at Icon or, you know, as far away as Santa Barbara, right? So this, one thing that social sciences and humanities folks can learn from your STEM colleagues in this particular aspect is reaching out to faculty early because you have shared intellectual interests, maybe because you integrated their work into your thesis project or cited them or read their book as part of a seminar. Reaching out to those faculty because they resonate with you is a great way to build a relationship and also potentially have a great advocate when you're applying to programs. And that is totally underutilized as a resource. This is Murphy with the same ball, but it's blue. A few things here about campus visits, interviews, and what's called Accepted Students Day. When it comes to campus visits, and these, like I said, these things can be virtual, I think it's important to try to participate in classes where possible, to listen more than you talk when you go. You want to basically say, you know, I'm a prospective student. I'm here to contribute to today's conversation if I can, but sitting in and kind of getting the feel for seminars is really important for you to soak up the vibe. It's also a good opportunity for you to evaluate the culture of the program. What does seminar look like at this particular institution? How do faculty interact with students? At the same time, of course, you might be on display a little bit. You might be evaluated in these particular contexts, and so you should know that, right? So pre-admissions decisions, campus visits are opportunities to connect with faculty, talk about your interests, maybe talk about your application and your overall trajectory as a potential graduate student. They're also opportunities for you to look under the hood and get a sense of what the culture is like. When it comes to interviews, I think overall, like I said, it's a positive that more programs are conducting interviews than in the past. They're not just looking at your test scores, you on paper, your personal statement. They're instead trying to get a sense of you as a person in the room or in the virtual space. That said, academia can often be pretty complicated, and the line between personal and professional can get blurry in a way that feels uncomfortable. And you're not wrong for feeling uncomfortable in this blurring of those spaces. So, for example, you may be interviewed and asked totally appropriate questions about your work, your research, your interests, and then the interview will end and maybe you'll go into lunch or coffee and someone will ask you a question about your partner or spouse or significant other. It's not legal to ask about sexual orientation in a kind of in what essentially counts as a job interview, but very often these informal spaces become very personal. They feel social. There are questions that are asked that may be inappropriate. And again, you have every right to feel uncomfortable in those moments, and it takes a little bit of management. So just this is something that you don't have to be afraid of. It's just something to know that you can be a strong advocate for yourself. And we can always talk after interviews to kind of debrief, talk before about how to prepare for them. It's just something I want to have on your radar. I want you to have on your radar before you go out into interviews. And finally, there's Admitted Students Day. And this is great. You're in, you're admitted. You get a chance to visit campus. I've seen many, when I worked in graduate school, I've seen many Admitted Students Days that go awry. People are extremely excited. They let the kind of ceremony of being admitted, the relief of being admitted, kind of get the best of them, and they end up making kind of a tough first impression. You know, this is an opportunity for you to shine with the faculty, to make a good first impression, to distinguish yourself as someone who's serious and, you know, ready to jump in as a graduate student. It's important not to let this part of the process blind you into thinking that, oh, you're just in college again with wholly new friends. This is an opportunity for you to kind of enter with the best first impression possible and set yourself up well for success in the fall. Okay, as promised, 5 words about standardized tests, and then we'll open it up for questions, and I can stick around after 5 today for sure. Don't worry too dang much, all right? With an asterisk, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this, along with, I think, letters of recommendation, standardized tests, and particularly the GRE, are sites of enormous anxiety when it comes to applying to graduate school. And my kind of rule of thumb is if taking the standardized tests is really that big of an obstacle, you know, if you think that it's going to overshadow everything else about your academic performance, your personal statement, your writing sample, the letters of recommendation, then I would recommend taking a step back and thinking about the ways that candidates have multiple opportunities to make an impression on faculty admissions committees. In some disciplines, subject tests can indeed be important. So I want to basically lay out my points here. But in general, the GRE is just not as significant, in my experience, as other parts of the application. If your GRE score is exceptionally low, then you can certainly talk about why that might be the case in the essay prompt that is, again, more and more common on applications about what should we understand about your application materials that might not otherwise stand out, or that we might not otherwise have context for. There is increasing cognizance of the need for accommodations. There's increasing understanding of the need for accommodations. All this is good news for those folks who experience learning differences, who need more time on tests, who are not test takers. I think in general, there is much more of an awareness of this in multiple institutions, and this is good news. So you should definitely make sure that you're asking for accommodations around testing, particularly in a virtual environment, because you are entitled to them, and there's more understanding about what it means to need those. Like I said, I think that subject area tests can be more important depending on the field. There shouldn't be a comma after that ask. There should just be an exclamation point. You should definitely ask faculty in your field, both at Barnard and maybe the administrator at the programs where you're applying, how important the subject area tests can be, which subject area tests might be beneficial, and which are optional and therefore you can avoid without consequence. Working back up the list at this point, GREs are essentially a tiebreaker with other candidates. If it's really close and neck, a substantial difference in a GRE score could potentially tip one candidate into a scholarship that another candidate doesn't. It could potentially, and I've actually literally never seen this in my personal experience reviewing graduate applications to master's programs. I've never seen GREs keep a person out of a program unless there were other significant problems with the application. I'm not trying to say don't take these things seriously. I'm just trying to say don't study for standardized tests at the expense of also putting a lot of effort into the other elements of your application that may very well make much more of a difference in the context of these programs. So we have time today for questions. That's me saying goodbye to Murphy. He was so sad. Like, I'm not gonna lie, you guys. Murphy and I are kind of best friends when we're together. So do you have questions? I am here. You can put them into the chat or you can shout them out. I see two of my colleagues spying on this too. Maybe they can ask questions. Brianna and Christine, do you have questions? Should a rec come from someone who taught you in your first and second year, or is it better to have someone that's more recent? Elizabeth, another great question about recommendations. I think that if the kind of golden rule is you want to pick someone who knows you best. If you haven't spoken to a professor in a little while, it's better to reinitiate that relationship and kind of say that you're intending on graduate school. And if you still think that the work that you did for them in their classes in sophomore year is representative of some of your best work, that's great. They can talk really knowledgeably about that. And if you have someone who's a faculty who you got to know in your third and fourth year, and you got to know one in your second year well enough to get a letter, that shows a really good progression or consistent high level of academic performance across your undergraduate years. And I think that can be really beneficial. What I often see useful for students who are asking professors for letters from the first half of their Barnard experience is that they might send them an updated paper. If their writing sample isn't from that class, is instead a seminar paper from third or fourth year, they'll just send that paper to the potential letter writer and say, I'd be happy to talk about this and how your class was important in setting me down the path towards majoring in political science or majoring in sociology. So I don't think it's better or worse to have someone from an earlier part of your academic experience. I do think that if you're going to go with someone from sophomore year and someone from junior year and someone from senior year, this is the right way to kind of communicate to letter writers what you're expecting from each of their letters. Hope that's helpful. And always tell me if there's follow-ups. Tell me. What is a reasonable number of graduate programs to apply to? I think this is a good and important question, especially for those of you who are considering the cost of applying, right? This is not a cheap endeavor. And so I think being cognizant of costs is always important. So too is the capacity that you have to really dedicate an amount of time to each application that allows you to tailor the application to each institution. So I guess there's one more input too, is where are the top programs? So, and what is the mix of programs that you want to apply to? Let me give you a very short answer first, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to kind of go through each of those points. I think the right amount of programs to apply to in aggregate across everything is probably between 6 and 9. That's a number that I've a little bit plucked out of the air. It's a little bit 2 really strong programs, 2 programs where you're a good fit, 2 programs that might be good, like solid, I hate to say safeties, but especially with doctoral programs, but programs where you would be very happy to go and where the subfield is a little bit lower ranked than the other programs, or 3-3-3 with the same kind of split. This is definitely something that you can always talk with your faculty about. They will have a much better sense of how many super strong programs there are. But I think that it's more of a question of the second point, which is how much can you tailor your personal statement? How much research can you do to make sure that you are communicating the strength of your application which is another way of saying how tailored can you make your application to the number of programs that you're applying. Like I would much rather have you write better applications for fewer programs than I would want you to write general applications for a big swath of programs. I think that's almost always true. And I think actually that's advice that I would give even across other disciplines outside of these. Thanks, Steph, for that question. Anything else? All right, well, tomorrow we are going to be together again for personal statements. We'll talk about some best practices around crafting personal statements, and I will give you my basic spiel on outlining statements that I think are effective, that could be the kind of first draft that you share with faculty as soon as September, so that if you're thinking about applying this year, you're on your way. And then if you're thinking about applying in the future, you have a good base to build on when you move forward from here. As always, y'all, if you have feedback, feel free to give me a shout. I want these things to be responsive to what you're up to. And I feel so self-conscious sometimes with these black screens. So if there's something I'm not answering, send an email and I will be happy to make sure that we make time to follow up. But otherwise, have a good evening. For those of you who are in New York, stay cool, keep the air on, hydrate. Your mom tells you to. Bye.